Good afternoon. The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Today, the Rules Committee is convening to consider H.R. 1048, H.J. Res. 24, and H.J. Res. 75. First, we'll turn to H.R. 1048, the Deterrent Act. This legislation will bring much-needed transparency, accountability, and clarity to foreign gift reporting requirements for colleges and universities across the nation. It strengthens Section 117 of the Higher Education Act, which was intended to protect American colleges and universities from nefarious foreign donations. Foreign influence within higher education is not something to be taken lightly. It poses a seismic threat and one that must be addressed without delay. Without meaningful measures to increase transparency and accountability, we will never fully understand the true amount of foreign funds being funneled into colleges and universities. Under current law, institutions of higher education must adhere to these reporting requirements, though many fail to do so because of how weak current law actually is. A 2019 Senate report found that up to 70% of colleges and universities failed to comply with the law. That's unacceptable and must be changed. Next, we turn to H.J. Res. 24, a Congressional Review Act resolution that overturns another wrong-headed midnight rule from the Department of Energy relating to conservation standards for walk-in coolers and walk-in freezers. The Department of Energy issued this final rule a mere 2 days before Christmas last year. Yet another gift from the Biden administration that nobody asked for. This midnight rule piles on additional costs to the shoulders of Main Street businesses, while at the very same time takes a hatchet to consumer choice. Today, we're breaking out the shovels and burying this midnight rule in the grave where it belongs. Good riddance. Consumer choice is here to stay. Lastly, we turn to H.J. Res. 75, a Congressional Review Act resolution that overturns yet another wrong-headed rule by the Department of Energy relating to conservation standards for commercial refrigeration freezers and refrigerator freezers. Like the previous rule from the Department of Energy that was just discussed, this rule is yet another example of the regulatory barrage that the Biden administration launched against Main Street as well as consumers. Regulating this country into the ground benefits absolutely no one. That's an indisputable fact. Like the last rule, we'll bury this one in the grave also. Nobody will miss it. With that, I look forward to today's discussion, and I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. McGovern, for any comments he wishes to make.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And I've really got to say that I'm so glad that Republicans are finally tackling a major issue that everybody, and I mean everybody, is talking about all the time: commercial walk-in freezers. Oh my God, I mean, coming off your recent deep dives into pool heaters and hot water tanks, I've got to hand it to this majority. You're really zeroed in on what's most important to the American people. Keep at it, because nothing says we're listening like congressional action on commercial refrigeration equipment. But if you happen to find a little extra time moving forward, maybe you might want to talk about something that I'm actually hearing about from my constituents, like how Donald Trump is openly using the Department of Justice to go after his political enemies, or how he's dismantling entire federal agencies, purging civil servants, and replacing them with loyalists. Maybe you could talk about how he and Elon are threatening to screw around with Social Security, even as people's retirement accounts are tanking because of chaotic economic proposals and reckless trade wars, or how his tariffs are already driving up prices for everyday goods again, hitting working families with a hidden tax while he pretends to stand up for them. And maybe you could discuss how he's telling people to buy Tesla stock while whining and dining Elon Musk at Mar-a-Lago. That's called corruption. Or how he's turning the presidency into his own get-rich-quick scheme while claiming to speak for the working people. I dare you to hold a town hall and tell your constituents what Republicans are using this committee to do. Hold hearings on commercial appliances while Donald Trump burns down the government. And as if wasting time on commercial freezer bills isn't bad enough, you're bringing up H.R. 1048, the Deterrent Act. Now, let's be real. This is all about handing Donald Trump and his cronies another tool to go after schools, students, and faculty who dare to challenge their ideology. This is about punishing higher education institutions, and maybe you guys think that learning is a liberal conspiracy. Because the bottom line is this isn't about policy, it's about fear. You either toe the line, you either say what we want you to say, do what we want you to do, or you'll be punished. It's also about gutting the Department of Education and making it so that the only people who can afford college are the ones already at the top. Gutting the Department of Education means larger class sizes. It means fewer teachers. It means higher tuition. And it means devastating cuts to research and innovation, research that leads to medical cures, climate solutions, and economic growth, all to bankroll tax cuts for billionaires and appease the whims of a man who thinks democracy is an inconvenience. Well, Democrats believe in something better. We believe government should work for all people, not just the wealthiest few. We believe in investing in education, healthcare, housing, clean air and water, and jobs. We're ready to work with anyone serious about delivering results for working families, but we will not stand by while Trump and his Republican enablers try to turn the government into their own personal ATM and a weapon for retaliation and revenge. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. Without objection, any prepared statements that our witnesses may have will be included in the record. I now welcome our first panel, Chairman Tim Walberg and Ranking Member Bobby Scott, my good friends from the Committee on Education and the Workforce. Your full statement will be submitted for the record, and we ask that you summarize your statement in 5 minutes. Chairman Walberg, I welcome your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's good to be in front of you and the committee today. Foreign nations, including our biggest adversaries like the Chinese Communist Party, contribute billions to American universities. The lack of transparency around foreign relationships should cause concern for every American as we see a rise in stolen research, anti-Semitic propaganda, and academic censorship. H.R. 1048, the Bipartisan Deterrent Act, brings much-needed transparency to the financial ties that our universities have with foreign entities. While American institutions have research and financial partnerships with foreign institutions, we know that our adversaries often hijack these legitimate partnerships to undermine our nation's interests. Investigations by the first Trump administration found billions in foreign funding to colleges and universities were unreported. And unfortunately, there are plenty of recent examples just in the last 2 years of schools and faculty failing to disclose troubling partnerships regarding sensitive research. Of course, the incidents we see are just the tip of the iceberg. Without transparency, we have no idea the true amount or use of these foreign funds. It's disturbing that we have little to no idea the true amount or impact of foreign funds at our institutions. We should be proactive, not reactive. When it comes to threats on our college campuses, it's time to pass the Deterrent Act. This bill holds institutions accountable by slashing the foreign gift reporting threshold for colleges, especially for adversarial nations like China and Iran. It also closes reporting loopholes that have allowed institutions to skirt the rules. Most importantly, however, this bill puts in place strong enforcement mechanisms that will lead to greater partnerships and accountability, like pulling federal student aid funding from institutions that refuse to comply after multiple violations. The bottom line is that the Deterrent Act will keep our adversaries at bay and hold our institutions to a higher standard. Last Congress, under your leadership, Chairwoman Fox, the Deterrent Act was able to pass the House floor with strong bipartisan support. I look forward to seeing this bipartisan bill pass the floor again and get signed into law, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Representative Scott, you're recognized for your comments.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member McGovern, members of the committee, I'm here today to speak in opposition of H.R. 1048. First, I have to point out that earlier this month, the Secretary of Education fired half the staff at the Department of Education, and last week, President Trump signed an executive order to dismantle the department altogether. To date, the administration has shown little regard for the irreparable harm this will cause students, educators, and future workforce and parents who are already struggling. Moreover, their actions are forcing more dedicated civil servants with invaluable institutional knowledge out of the federal government. And they'll be, of course, replaced by political appointees who will answer only to President Trump and Elon Musk. So we're here today to discuss the merits of H.R. 1048, a bill that would increase work and responsibility of the very department this administration is actively dismantling. This Congress, Republican majority in both House and Senate, has a real opportunity to address the many real pressing issues that students actually face, like closing achievement gaps, addressing college accessibility and affordability, and ending gun violence in schools. But here we are. The first bill we considered was a bill to allow bullying of trans students who want to join their school sports teams, and this bill, which will isolate America from its key allies. Global collaborations have allowed universities to make bold, forward-thinking strides in health, science, and technology for their communities and people across the world. Additionally, institutions have collaborated with the U.S. government to enhance our research ecosystems by attracting and retaining researchers and scholars from around the world. These partnerships have strengthened the inner workings of our economy and positioned America as a leader in scientific and intellectual research. But as written, the Deterrent Act would codify the Trump administration's ability to seize funds from schools if they're found to be engaging with any country or representative that the Secretary of State deems a threat. In fact, despite concerns stakeholders and I have raised, the bill fines colleges $50,000 after a single reporting mistake, but fails to provide any support to help under-resourced colleges manage this absurdly onerous reporting. The bill would also force institutions to deviate from the established compliance and reporting guidelines already in existence under Section 117 of the Higher Education Act and the significant guidance and reporting already required from other federal agencies. It would also disincentivize institutions from hiring talented international faculty because they fear that their federal funding could be indiscriminately pulled. For example, the bill singles out partnerships with entities and scholars from certain countries, quote, of concern, unquote, targeting researchers based purely on their nationality. So let's be clear, this legislation that provides targeted and thoughtful steps to protect our research, let's be clear, we need legislation that provides targeted and thoughtful steps to protect our research and develop initiatives, but we need to do it without jeopardizing global partnerships that benefit everybody. And to do so, I've offered a thoughtful alternative to improve Section 117 compliance and support institutions as they evaluate and implement their research integrity and foreign influence policies. That amendment builds on the Biden administration's work to support global partnerships and curb undue foreign influence without stifling innovation or creating hostile campus environments for international students. Specifically, it aligns reporting requirements with those of federal agencies and requires the Secretary of Education to go through negotiated rulemaking to address key implementation of Section 117. To that end, I strongly urge my colleagues to accept the amendment and reject 1048 as it's currently drafted. And to bring us back to reality before I conclude, this will all be moot if we dismantle the Department of Education because you won't have anyone to administer the program. I challenge my Republican colleagues who know that abolishing the Department of Education will harm our children to impose the administration's actions publicly. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you very much both for your testimony. And I just have one question. Chairman Walberg, last week, President Trump issued an executive order regarding the closing of Department of Education, and Representative Scott mentioned it, that regards to the executive order and the intent of the bill, how would the provisions of your bill be implemented if the Department of Education were to be shut down?
Well, I appreciate that question and the concern that my friend, colleague on the committee has about that. But we know that the President in his executive order made it very clear that we would need Congress to act if we're going to abolish the entire department, to right-size it, to depower certain parts of it, to shift certain provisions that we have assumed come from the Department of Education and give those to other departments, like has been done in the past with Health and Human Services. Department of Treasury has the capability of writing checks. On this very thing, we certainly have the potential of keeping it in the Department of Education as long as it's there. If not, there's the Department of Justice that has capabilities of doing these things. 117, Section 117 was not used at all during President Biden's term, not at all, which encouraged some of the things that we're concerned with now to take place. So I don't think we have a problem with what's in place now as long as we put teeth and use Section 117 as this bill attempts to do. And again, it is a bipartisan bill. There were 31 Democrats who voted for it in the last term, and I think it shows that it's well-positioned to care for the needs, especially when we have countries like Russia, China, specifically the Chinese Communist Party, Iran, and North Korea involved. Those are our concerning countries.
Thank you very much. I'd call on Mr. McGovern.
Yeah, thank you. Chairman Walberg, let me just first ask you, Mr. Scott has an amendment, and this is the Rules Committee. Do you have any, would you support this committee making in order his amendment so that we can bring it to the floor and discuss it?
I will leave that to the committee to do that. I think the bill is drafted very well. Again, it was a bipartisan bill, and I'm going to stand with my bill.
So,
I prefer no amendments.
Okay, all right. Well, but that's a trend in this committee, because most of the bills coming out of here are closed rules. I feel like we're in Russia sometimes. But you began by talking about that this is about our national security, and I kind of found that rich, especially when I'm looking at what we learned today. I don't know if you saw the article in The Atlantic by Jeffrey Goldberg, but his article is entitled, "The Trump Administration Accidentally Texted Me Its War Plans. U.S. national security leaders included me in a group chat about upcoming military strikes in Yemen, and I didn't think it could be real. Then the bombs started falling." I ask unanimous consent to insert this in the record.
Without objection.
But on this text chain was the Vice President of the United States, the Secretary of Defense. I'm just looking really briefly here. Michael Walls, and John Ratcliffe. I mean, if you're worried about national security, let me tell you, you got bigger problems on your hands right now. And I'm hoping that maybe there'll be some oversight hearings into how something like this can happen. I mean, you got a team in place, especially the Department of Defense, who are not qualified to be there, quite frankly, and this is the kind of stuff you get. Want to talk about national security threats? This is a national security threat, and I hope that my Republican friends will look into it. Mr. Scott, I mean, you heard what Mr. Walberg said. Don't worry, be happy. Some other agencies will pick up the slack. I mean, my understanding is that already 2,000 people have been cut from the Department of Education. You know, I don't know who's going to administer all the different programs that the Department of Education administers, by the way, to the entire country. But I was interested if you had a response to.
Well, what has to be reported are gifts, and if it's from a, quote, country of concern, which could be a citizen of a country of concern, there's no value limitation, any gift, cup of coffee, anything. And so it's without regard to the amount, the value. He says countries like, and named a couple, the colleges trying to comply would have to ascertain which are the countries of concern. And without any professional development, I'm not sure most would be able to figure that out. And it's a changing list. So I guess you got to keep up to just make sure the Secretary of State hadn't stuck another name or two on there.
Right. So any country that the administration deems a country of concern.
If it's on the list, and you gotta go, it's cross-references what country of concern means. And all it does is if you don't know the citizenship of your colleague, if you're a university professor, you don't necessarily know the citizenship of your colleagues. And so the safe thing to do would be just discriminate against anybody that looks foreign.
So,
And that would be the effect of this legislation.
so basically it says, this bill allows the administration to add any country they deem to be engaging in, quote, conduct that is detrimental to the national security or foreign policy of the United States, end quote, as a foreign country of concern. That's the way this is. So does that mean if this bill becomes law, the administration can, continue its absurd feud with our closest neighbors and add Canada and Mexico as a foreign country of concern?
Well, and how would you find out? You're going to keep up with the federal record? And if you've got a Canadian colleague and you're doing research, all of a sudden, if they bring coffee and donuts to the office, all of a sudden, accepting coffee and donuts, you find you got to report that, and you're on the list of people who have accepted foreign gifts.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess my problem with all of this is that it boils down to just trust us. I mean, Donald Trump's administration isn't going to add a country to this concern list just because, their feelings got hurt. I mean, that's my worry. I mean, just trust us. And going back to what I said before, I mean, I'm looking at what has already been done at the Department of Education. They've gone from 4,000 employees for the whole nation down to 2,000. And then we're being told that they're going to move student loans over to the Small Business Administration. Is that what your understanding, Chairman?
It's our understanding as of today, but it's not our understanding that it's permanent.
Well, but I also want to insert into the record, and ask unanimous consent for this, an article from Bloomberg Government. Small Business Administration had cut 43% of its workers in Doge push.
Without objection.
I mean, I get that nobody wants to say anything or question the administration in any way, shape, or form. But, I mean, it is really concerning when you're seeing these dramatic cuts happen, I mean, quite quickly, without a lot of thought being given to where the cuts are coming. And then we're moving this program, the student loan program, over to Small Business Administration, which has other responsibilities, and they're supposed to administer this, and they're being cut by 43% as of right now. I mean, maybe even more. So forgive me when I say I don't have any reason to trust this administration. Again, as I said, just today we found out that the Vice President, the Secretary of Defense, and the Director of National Intelligence and others leaked a sensitive military operation via text to a random phone number that turned out to be a reporter. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. And if this is what the administration is doing when it comes to keeping our service members safe, to protecting our secrets from our enemies, then guess what? I don't trust them when it comes to our students and our children and our education, or to administer this program in a way that, quite frankly, is dedicated to protecting our national security. I yield back.
Thank you. I would call on Mr. Roy.
I thank the chair. I thank the gentleman for appearing before the committee. We're talking about trust, and I would just ask Representative Wahlberg, I don't know if you share some of your concerns about trust, about the previous administration's handling national security when we lost 13 of our men and women in uniform in the disastrous departure from Afghanistan, or the trust in terms of leaving billions of dollars of equipment behind for our enemies to be able to use against us, and documentation that demonstrates it's being used against us. The trust that we have in an administration that doxed U.S. Special Forces soldiers in Israel, which the Biden administration had to admit and apologize for. So if I want to hear about the, trust that I have in administration, it certainly isn't the one that had us, basically handing over the keys to the kingdom with respect to our enemies, with respect to China, Iran, and yes, Russia, by its foolish energy policies and putting our allies and our own nation at risk. I assume the gentleman agrees with his concerns about the previous administration's handling of national security.
Certainly I do. Also, getting back to the issue at hand of education. After Congress put through legislation to simplify FAFSA so that students and their families could understand what potential they had for student loans and resources, the Department of Education couldn't do that. And for 3 years, students went without an understanding of what they had available to them. That was part of the law already in place, and the Department of Education, that since 1980 has spent over $3 trillion to have worse NAEP scores come out and continue to downgrade. So if we're talking about trust, the trust isn't there. But what we're talking of here is simply saying that a professor that takes some funds, a gift, has to come under the basically same provisions as a member of Congress in what we have to report and what we receive. That's trust. That's security issue. When we talk about $50 million or more coming from a foreign country, we ought to know about it. If the University of Michigan, I'll pick on my own, if the University of Michigan can determine what alumni or businesses are contributing to their athletic programs, I would think that the University of Michigan can determine what dollars are coming from China or North Korea or Iran or Russia. That's a simple reporting requirement. Again, if they can do it for their sports program, they can do it for this.
And to be clear, this legislation garnered 31 Democrats in support of it in the last Congress. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And we're addressing issues, for example, that American colleges and universities have disclosed $40 billion in foreign funding since 1981. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Including $1.1 billion in foreign payments in 2021 alone. And specifically, for example, a congressional investigation of certain research universities making clear that $40 million in unreported research contracts with the Chinese Communist Party. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So all we're trying to do, again, with 31 Democrats in agreement in the last Congress, is point out the extent to which we have our own enemies and our own adversaries funding our own institutions of higher education, which is undermining not only our national security, but the education of our youth. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So pretty straightforward piece of legislation. Chinese sources have participated in donations or contracts worth more than $426 million to U.S. universities since 2011. Does that sound about right?
That sounds about right, maybe not quite enough.
And so, exactly, it's probably more. And we wouldn't know because there's a lot of anonymous sources that we can't track. And we're trying.
117 wasn't used in the last 4 years.
So for all of our constituents out there listening, we simply just want to know whether your taxpayer dollars or borrowed money, how that's being used to set up universities that then have foreign money coming in to have massive influence on what your children are being taught and educated, and whether that's undermining our own national security. That's what we're trying to do here.
And the IP that is taken.
And there should be nothing partisan about that at all, correct?
Shouldn't be. This is a bipartisan bill.
Yeah, and the last point I'll make, and I'll yield back, is on the other matters boards to say are unimportant. For the average small business owner who's having to deal with regulations and walk-in refrigerators or whatever it might be, it's really important. It's really important for a small business that wants to try to operate and not have to deal with the rubric of regulations that the previous administration is piling on small businesses. I mean, I just had to introduce a piece of legislation to try to unwind the complexities around a gas can, literally the Gas Can Freedom Act. So you can actually undo that the United States government has messed up a gas can. And you know what? The people that I work with, I see my colleagues are kind of shaking their heads, oh, this is unimportant. You know what it's important to? All the guys that I work with around my district who are just beside themselves frustrated. They literally can't just go buy a $5 gas can filled with gas and pour it into their frickin' tractor without having to go through all the gyrations of a highly regulated device, supposedly for their safety. The American people are sick and tired of it. That's why they're backing the president. That's why they're backing an administration that's trying to undo the burden. Meanwhile, when we're spending $7 trillion with $5 trillion of income coming in, with $36 trillion of debt and counting, maybe, just maybe, there are some bureaucrats we can find to fire and some regulations to cut. I yield back.
Thank you. I would yield to Mrs. Scanlon from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, and I'd yield a minute or two to my colleague, Mr. McGovern.
Just briefly, maybe in your district, the number one issue is gas cans or refrigerators, but in my district, people are worried about Social Security, they're worried about Medicaid, they're worried about Medicare, they're worried about whether their kids can afford to get a college education. And all those things are under attack right now. And you can deny it all you want, but this administration has made clear where it's coming from. And in terms of national security, again, let me just read this slowly so that it sinks in. The Trump administration accidentally texted me its war plans. This is according to Jeffrey Goldberg from the Atlantic magazine. U.S. national security leaders included me in a group chat about upcoming military strikes in Yemen. I didn't think it could be real. Then the bomb started falling. So I get the gentleman from Texas. He's okay with, with the administration texting their classified war plans to a reporter on an unsecured phone. Boy, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we heard for 5 years about Hillary's emails, not a peep when they put classified National Security Council war plans on an iPhone. Give me a break. That nobody's concerned about that? That's not a national security issue? I mean, we're talking about this bill that somehow all these foreign countries are going to infiltrate our universities to be able to, to figure out what's going on, with our most sensitive national security issues. Our enemies, all they need to do is just read our text messages from the National Security Agency to get all the secrets. This is a real problem, and I hope some on the other side will recognize that. But the people who are running this show, quite frankly, are not qualified. I yield to the gentleman.
Well, we don't want to we don't want to lose the fact that any gift that has the possibility of influencing a college is already reportable. This just brings the threshold down to 0 for a list of countries that nobody knows what's on the list.
So if I get a cup of coffee, that has to be reported.
You got to report it.
That makes a lot of sense. Talk about excessive bureaucracy. Thank you for yielding.
Okay, thank you. I'm always happy to talk about funding for our universities, but I have to say I'm a lot more concerned right now about the funding that's been illegally impounded that goes to research and development at our universities, especially having just spent the last 10 days in my district, where I had one research group tell me that they had to stop the trials for ovarian cancer. They're actually treating people with promising medications for ovarian cancer, but they had to stop it because their funding through NIH was stopped. In another place, they had cuts to research on how different medical conditions impact our marginalized communities. But apparently that runs afoul of this administration's DEI prohibition. So if you're poor or you're Black, well, then you don't get to have research done on how your medical condition might be different. And then I got to talk to some of our building contractors. Because all this funding is being held up to the universities are having to shift their plans. In order to keep funding some of their research, they're canceling construction. So I'm talking to a contractor who this week has to go and lay off half of his team because the universities have had to pull back because this administration has illegally impounded their funding. So, if we're going to talk about funding for our universities, that's where I would start, with the real-time harm that is being done to colleges and universities across this country and how that harm is spreading to the health, education, and welfare of people across this country, and then even now, talk about trickle-down effect, trickling down and harming our contractors and businesses in those arenas. But coming back to this, I understand this is an area where there's been bipartisan agreement in the past that we need to have transparency with respect to where funding is coming from. And just, if you could highlight for us a little bit, Mr. Scott, just how are those concerns addressed with your amendment? And why doesn't this bill do it?
Well, first of all, it sets a threshold that makes reporting consistent with what's already going on. The idea that people are giving gifts that are creating foreign influence, anything that could create that kind of influence is already reportable. This just creates a ridiculous situation where if you go to a colleague's daughter's wedding and there's value in attending the reception, that you got to report it. Do you go? So your name's on a list of people who've taken gifts from countries of concern? I don't know. Okay. And so it just creates an absurd situation. It encourages discrimination against people. It would require you to check out their citizenship. The fact that someone is from a foreign country doesn't mean they're not a U.S. citizen.
Okay. So it sounds like a concern that might be able to be addressed by amendment.
Yeah.
Okay. I do share your concern that this creates new opportunities for bullying in the academic world, and we've certainly seen far too much of that over the last week or two. So I appreciate your testimony, and I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. I would yield to Representative Langworth.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. As Mr. Roy pointed out, a congressional investigation into this matter revealed that 2 top research universities uncovered nearly $40 million in unreported research contracts with the Chinese Communist Party. Representative Wahlberg, would top universities with armies of administrative staff and billions of dollars in resources simply not report substantial amounts of money in contracts with these entities controlled by our greatest adversary?
Well, that's our concern, and that's what we've seen take place, as you just reminded us, with some major universities, including schools like Stanford, that were in the news for doing that very thing. And like I said, they have the capabilities of determining what athletic boosters and organizations are contributing finances to athletes or the athletic program. I would think they could, with 4 specific countries, bad actors countries, very clear what they are on the list. It's not hard to find out. And if that's changed, that'll be fairly clear as well. But right now, 4 specific schools or countries that sit on that list of bad actors. I'd be certain that the attorneys that they pay could figure out how to report that.
And can you remind us again, what did the Biden administration do to cripple the enforcement efforts already on the books for these institutions who they really refuse to adhere to existing law?
They just didn't use Section 117. They just didn't use it. And we spent 4 years with that taking place, and that can continue.
Well, I really appreciate your testimony here. Between infiltration by CCP-backed entities and the violent demonstrations raging on college campuses against our Jewish students, institutions of higher education are long overdue for some very serious accountability and transparency. And I look forward to supporting this rule and this legislation on the floor, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Neguse.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Chairman Wahlberg, Ranking Member Scott, for being here today and for your respective testimonies. Mr. Chairman, a couple of quick questions for you. So I take it you support the Department of Education's recently announced reduction in force. Is that correct?
I do.
Okay. This is the 50% reduction in force that Secretary McMahon of the Department of Education has initiated, so wiping out half of the personnel at DOE, right?
I do.
Okay. And you support President Trump's executive order, which he's purporting to initiate the dismantling of the Department of Education?
I do.
Okay. This bill purports to create a number of statutory requirements that will be imposed on universities across the country, one of which is to file reports, as you've detailed. Who are those reports filed with?
It'll go to the Department of Education until...
To which department?
It will go to the Department of Education that is still in existence and will continue to be in existence until the Congress passes both houses.
I see.
For repeal.
So the universities should file these reports with the department that just had half of its workforce eliminated and that President Trump has announced he would like to dismantle, both of which you support, but you believe we should pass this bill to impose reporting obligations on these universities. Who are they filing it with? I guess you're saying the 50% of the employees that are left, they'll file it with those folks?
That's the job of the Department of Education until it is no longer there.
I see.
That's
And
what we deal with.
Sure, and once this administration has succeeded in its efforts to completely empty this agency, then what?
We move 117 to the appropriate entity that will handle it.
What entity is that?
That will be what we determine as Congress.
That you would determine, that we would determine
that we
collectively as
determine it.
Congress. That sounds very different than what President Trump has
Well, no,
indicated.
that's what he said as well. He indicated clearly that the Department of Education couldn't be fully eliminated without an act of Congress. He
Here's what
understands that as well.
This is what I'm trying to understand, Chairman Walberg, because I've reviewed every page of this bill. It imposes a number of comprehensive obligations and requirements on the Department of Education, right?
Correct.
Right. It requires the Department of Education to publish a database of every single report that is filed by institutions of higher education across the country, right?
Transparency, yes.
Correct. And that's, the website is supposed to be, the database is supposed to be updated every 30 days, right?
Correct.
Right? And it requires the Department of Education to engage in an interagency process in which they are initiating legal action with the Attorney General if they find that a report was filed invalidly, correct?
Correct.
Correct. I'm trying to better understand how you can come before this committee and ask the Congress to pass a bill imposing a litany of requirements on a department that you believe shouldn't exist, on a department that you just conceded you support emptying the bowels of this agency. Half of the people at the Department of Education are gone on administrative leave. And we're here entertaining a bill asking the department to publish a comprehensive database that will be updated in real time? Who do you think is going to build this database of you? I understand that you're passionate about it, but if you want this database built, why don't you support a Department of Education to build it? How can you ask us to eliminate the agency and simultaneously impose obligations on at the same time?
Well, I believe the Department of Education, as constituted by this administration, will have that authority and will have that ability.
I have no idea what you just, what do you?
I'm answering your question. The entity that is responsible for it within the Department of Education will be expected to carry it out.
What entity?
I believe we have an administration in place that will expect things to be done and will get them done.
What entity?
The Department of Education.
Do you know whether the sub-agency that would be responsible for publishing this database or the technical people building this database, do you know whether they exist anymore?
They certainly exist anymore because the department is there.
Could you tell me what agency that is?
It has been downsized. The same department that was there is still there. It's just less in number.
Yeah,
And efficiency
Chairman,
works in the private sector, ought to work in the public sector as well.
look, I would just simply suggest to you that if you are this interested and this passionate, as you clearly are, and as many of your colleagues are, about changing the law and requiring more of the Department of Education, a good way to achieve that might not be cutting half of the workforce overnight. It doesn't quite make sense to me how one can make the argument that the department should be dismantled, abolished, eliminated, but by the way, let's spend time passing bills that impose additional requirements on the very department that you intend to eliminate. I don't get it. And I don't think the American people get it either. I understand, this bill a year ago, it was a reference by my colleague from Texas about bipartisan support that existed for the bill. And I understand, folks that have arguments about the merits of the bill. That was before the President of the United States announced that he intended to eliminate this department altogether, unlawfully, of course, but nonetheless, to your point, inasmuch as Congress obviously has the right and the constitutional authority to decide the fate of this department, feels like maybe the debate we should be having is whether or not the Department of Education should exist, since there are clearly many of my colleagues, it sounds like perhaps the chairman of the Education Committee included, who don't believe it should, and there are those of us who do believe it should. And those who fall in the latter camp, I think they have the right to be able to debate whether new requirements should be imposed on the agency. But I find it very rich to suggest to the workers at the Department of Education who are literally on administrative leave, half of them, thousands of people across the country, that we're debating whether or not we should impose more requirements on them since they don't really have jobs right now. I'll give you an opportunity to respond.
We're not imposing it on them. They are no longer part of the department. But I respect your position. But we still have to function in reality. And right now we have actors that are very negative toward our country, dangerous toward our country, as well as our educational policy that are involved. So it's time for us to take action and make sure that Section 117 is carried out.
Sure. So, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. What happens in 2 weeks when Secretary McMahon decides that instead of the 50% RIF that she's already implemented, she's going to do a 90% RIF? Then what?
We'll deal with that when it comes.
What do you?
Right now, we live in the reality of what is.
Okay, so the secretary announces, this isn't a hypothetical. They eliminated half of the workforce already in the last 8 weeks. So if the secretary decides that she's going to proceed a step further and eliminate another 40% of the agency, your argument essentially is, well, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. The Department of Education will decide which statutory requirements, which new mandates, unfunded mandates Republicans in Congress have decided to impose on the Education Department that they should comply with and which they shouldn't. That's basically it.
Well, I guess my answer to that again is that's another issue. We're dealing with the issue of dealing with clandestine, dangerous actors of countries that are donating and contributing to our educational system, especially our higher education institutions. And what do we do about that? How do we carry out Section 117 in a more productive way?
Sure.
And how do we deal with the reality of those clandestine actors and what they're doing right now? That's the issue of this bill. I'm not debating whether we reform, repeal, abolish Department of Education. What do we do with the responsibility we have now with national security?
And I hear you, Mr. Chairman. I hear you, and I hear the passion in your voice, and I think all I'm suggesting is, who do these colleges file these reports with? Who do they, the bill says that the Department of Education is supposed to create a new singular point of contact to work with all the universities so that we can address the national security concerns that you've articulated so well. And my question to you is, I don't know how the department is supposed to do that when you're eliminating the department.
Well, we haven't eliminated the department.
They've gotten rid of half of it.
Well, it isn't all yet.
They're halfway there. Well, yeah, thank God.
The
Yeah,
bottom
for the
line
students
is-
and the kids across the country. Yeah, I'm grateful that they haven't eliminated the other 50%. And of course, the order itself, as you know, is the subject of litigation that was initiated today. And I doubt that the executive order will ultimately survive scrutiny by the courts. But nonetheless, anyway, we've belabored it. I'll give Ranking Member Scott an opportunity to
Thank you.
respond, and then I'm happy to yield to my
Just want to remind everybody that when we talk about national security, any significant gift is already reportable. In fact, under the Biden administration, they had over 100,000 reports of gifts and contracts totaling about $60 billion. It turns out a lot more than under the former Trump administration because Section 117 was been around for a long time. And this bill would increase astronomically the number of reports that have to be made.
Yeah, it's precisely the point, Ranking Member Scott and Chairman Walberg. I don't mean to be, confrontational. I guess I'm just suggesting maybe it's something we can consider with Chairwoman Fox when she returns. I think there should be a new rule for the Rules Committee, which is if you're going to submit a bill to the committee imposing obligations or requirements on an agency, you should have to believe that that agency should continue to exist. Like, that seems like a pretty simple requirement. So, for example, Chairman Walberg, if you believe that there should be certain requirements on the FBI, right, that there should be certain reports filed with the FBI, it would be reasonable to assume that you also believe the FBI should exist, right? It would be nonsensical to say, I have a bill, it's right here, and the bill says that the FBI shall do A, B, and C. But by the way, I don't believe that we should have an FBI, right? That wouldn't make sense, right? Or is that?
I would disagree to a point. I believe the function should be carried out, whether it's by FBI or any other agency is not the question. We deal with reality. Right now, the Department of Education, whether it's the large size, medium size, or the small size, is the department that deals with this issue.
Yeah, I'm not talking about size. The example I just gave you was its existence,
Well,
not its size.
It exists.
Yeah, correct.
It exists.
It does exist. But I didn't decide to put
It exists.
I didn't decide to put into this bill, Mr. Chairman, that the Secretary of Education would have responsibilities A, B, C, and D. You did. I didn't decide that the Department of Education would have obligations to create onerous databases that are updated every 30 days for the American public to view. You've decided that's important for the Department of Education to do, which is why you've proposed this bill. And I understand the reasons why. I'm simply suggesting it'd be probably pretty helpful to say, I think there should be a Department of Education to implement the bill that I've proposed that the Department of Education should implement. That doesn't seem controversial.
I respect your position.
All right. I thank the gentleman.
Mr. Neguse?
Yes,
We're at 11:50, and I know that the new chairwoman has wanted to limit.
I appreciate your indulgence. I did want to yield 20 seconds here to my colleague from Pennsylvania, but I'm
I appreciate that, and I will be brief. My colleague from Colorado raised the fact that we are tasked, that the Department of Education is tasked with certain responsibilities, and one of our colleagues, I think it was Mr. Langworthy, mentioned his interest in making sure that we are addressing anti-Semitism in our educational institutions. Of course, the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education is responsible for doing those investigations and having that redress. And with the riffing of half the Department of Education in Philadelphia alone, they laid off the entire Office of Civil Rights, dozens of people whose job it is to investigate and resolve those complaints. So this is a running theme here, that we have the administration basically gutting the functions of government, at the same time claiming that there are functions of government that have to be completed. So that's all. I'd yield back to Mr. Neguse.
Thank you very much, and I would yield to Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Chairman Walberg, I want you to know, I think the databases do matter. And, you know, there's been a lot of talk about cuts to certain higher education organizations that are not-for-profit, don't pay taxes. And I took the opportunity to look up one of them that's been in the press. I'll keep the name to myself right now, and I actually know how to pull a 990 report. And I pulled the 990s, and while they were complaining about, oh, it was better than a $100 million cut from the administration that was coming to them, that particular not-for-profit had $4.5 billion in revenue that exceeded expenses for the years 2020 and 2021. And I'm going to bring a piece of legislation over the next couple of weeks that's going to require these institutions that have over $5 billion worth of assets to put a link to their 990 on the landing page of their websites. I think the public would be aghast at how much cash some of these institutions are sitting on and just how much revenue they have that exceeds their expenses. And yet, anytime they get what, well, $100 million is a lot of money, it's a pinprick to somebody who's got $4.5 billion in profits over 2 years. How much money some of these institutions are sitting on that they've been gotten in the form of grants or, in this case, donations from other countries. And I think the general public has a right to know. So the databases matter. It's transparency in government. Now, there's been a lot of talk about the reductions in force at the Federal Department of Education. Can you tell me how many of those people that that reduction in force, which is approximately 50% of the Federal Department of Education, can you tell me how many of those people have a job teaching in a classroom?
0.
That's right. So we have state departments of education, we have local departments of education, and then we have a federal bureaucracy that shouldn't even be called a Department of Education. And so what we intend to do is to get rid of that bureaucracy. The money to the states can still flow just without the bureaucratic overhead and the micromanagement from the federal government of your state and local departments of education. And you could actually have more money to hire teachers. But again, the answer to the number of people that are being laid off at the Federal Department of Education that actually teach in the classroom is 0, correct? Madam Chair, I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you very much. I would call on Ms. Ledger Fernandez.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. You know, the thing about this bill, which I think the Democrats are struggling with, is precisely the fact that the president, with the support of Republicans, says it's going to eliminate the Department of Education, and has basically done so by eliminating half of the employees. And the idea that the work will be done anyway is some magical thinking. I met with farmers after the president froze all of that funding that was supposed to go to farmers with the EQIP grant and so many other grants. That was just terrifying for them. And they were saying, like, what do they think? You can't just say the seed is going to get planted and it's going to come up and we're going to, you know, reap the benefits. You need people to put that seed in the ground. You need people to make sure that those fields get watered. The same way you need people to make sure that the Department of Education, which is constitutionally created and funded, works. And that's why these lawsuits are going to win. Because you cannot say, it'll happen, they have the ability to do it. And I think that what we're seeing here is that there is a desire to kind of have us talk about things that aren't what our communities are talking about. When President Trump, and I've got that too, when President Trump said he was going to eliminate the Department of Education, you know what my constituents were talking about? They were talking about the importance of the federal funding to make sure that their special needs students got the help they required, because not all schools have the money to be able to fund the special education that children who have disabilities or special needs have, especially in rural areas. I had a teacher who shared with me the child who started elementary school and could not speak. And because of the federal funds that we sent to that school, by 4th grade, that child was not only speaking, but said he wanted to be a writer. And that is the miracle of education, is that it unleashes the potential, and sometimes that potential takes a little bit of extra work. And so no, the federal government is not mandating what you do. They are helping our poorest schools. They are helping students who need help because they are disabled, who have special needs. And that's what our constituents are worrying about. And that's not what we're talking about here today, because this legislation already exists. And so when we are turning our backs on those kids, that's what my constituents are wondering about. And you know what? Americans are wondering about. 64% of Americans want the Department of Education to continue because they know that education is one of those key things that government should be about. And, Ranking Member Scott, I mean, what are the things that you are hearing about what's happening to the Department of Education? And is it whether or not somebody should report whether they had donuts brought in or whether we should put Canada on the list? And this bill is not what the bill was last Congress. And we are not in the same place we were in last Congress, where we have a president who threatens a public university in Maine with retribution just because she disagrees with him. We have a president right now who is vindictive and will go after people for what they say and what they believe. And that is what is different about this bill. And Ranking Member Scott, I didn't know if you wanted to add some more.
No, well, I just wanted to respond to the Department of Education does not provide education, it protects civil rights, primarily in K through 12, disabled students, low-income areas, English as a second language, racial minorities, trying to eliminate this achievement gap. That's what the Department of Education does. And when it's left to the states, we know it doesn't work. When it's left to the states, you had segregated public schools. Left to the states, disabled students with disabilities did not get an education. We fund real estate. We fund education with the real estate tax. And so some areas are going to get a lot better deal than others, and Title I comes in and tries to equalize that. I mean, the Department of Education is there to guarantee that the education is a right which is made available to all on equal terms, which is language from the Brown v. Board of Education case.
Right, and the billionaire class, which is basically running this administration, they don't need public schools. But my constituents in my rural areas really do.
It's there to make sure that everyone can get an education. The actual education, the students, the teachers and whatnot, that's state and local. But because our life experience is, when you leave it to the states, certain identifiable groups get left behind. That's where the Department of Education comes in.
And when Congress uses its Article 1 authority to actually pass laws, fund programs, fund departments, create departments, you're not allowed to just say, I'm going to get rid of it by executive order and say, oh, but it shall be lawful. When you fire the people who need to carry out those programs and freeze the funding, that is violating the Constitution. And we'll see what the courts say. And I'm so pleased that until now, we've already had about 43, I think, different court opinions telling Trump you cannot continue to do this and violate the Constitution. Unless you have anything else,
That's good.
ranking member?
No.
Nope, I will yield back.
Thank you. And I would call on Mr. Griffith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would now yield some time to Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be brief. But my mother actually taught ESOL, which is English for Speakers of Other Languages, and Reading Recovery. So she taught people who English was not their native language or who had cognitive challenges in a Title I school system. And I can remember quite well, as the state representative of that school system, meeting with principals and counselors where those students were being treated as if they were cookie dough by the federal Department of Education, and local school systems doing the right thing and giving up some federal funds so that they could push forward with what the counselors and the educators agreed were in the best interest of those students. All we're talking about doing is not giving the federal Department of Education the ability to withhold funds that the local people who actually know the student and care about and want to teach that student that type of conduct from the federal Department of Education. Just block grant it to the states. I trust the people at the states. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on that because I do know that issue well because my mother actually taught it in a Title I system for a long time. With that, thank you, Mr. Griffith.
I appreciate that, Chairman Walberg. I have not had an opportunity to read all of the Department of Education bills over the years, but I am guessing that we didn't specify in the bill how many employees the Department of Education had to hire. Am I correct in that?
You're correct, and the department wasn't established in the Constitution.
Yeah, so the gentlelady, it was a minor difference. She misspoke. She said it was constitutionally passed. It was, and I got it. You're fine. It was legislatively adopted in accordance with the Constitution is what she meant to say. So, yeah, I got it. It's my time. I got it. Now, that said, I've heard a couple things here today, and I'm listening to the debate, and lots of stuff's going on. And the donut example, Mr. Chairman, and I'm speaking to Mr. Walberg, that only would apply to the countries of concern, which are currently Communist China, North Korea, Russia, and Iran. Am I correct in that?
You're correct.
So all you got to do is make sure you're not getting any donuts from those people, and the school has nothing to worry about. Am I correct?
That's correct, except fatty acids.
Well, fatty acids, all right. And if it's a gift larger than donuts, and it's not a country of concern, you have to hit a threshold of $50,000. Is that not correct?
Yes.
All right, I appreciate that. Now, one of the things that's been frustrating to me sitting here waiting my time is that my colleagues, and let me say, my dear friend from Virginia, Mr. Scott, is absolutely sincere when he's concerned about us, just turning it over without anything to look at taking care of Title I and disabled children, et cetera, and I understand that. And I speak only for myself. I got a little bit different view than most people. Because my friends on the other side of the aisle think the only way to solve this problem, Mr. Chairman, is to hire tens or hundreds of thousands of people to sit in either at home or in cubicles or in offices, wherever they're at, to keep track of everything that's happening in every school system so that every one of my schools complains to me when I go to them that they have so much paperwork to fill out that it's hardly worth it. And I submit to you, I'm not going to ask you to comment because I'm going out on a limb that I'm willing to go out on, and that I suspect Mr. Scott might join me if he had no other choice. I'm not going to ask him either. I'm just going to state it. If we changed it from having tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of employees in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area drawing lots of money out of education, and instead set the guidelines up by federal law, and then allowed our friends at the trial bar to get attorney's fees and court costs for enforcing the federal requirements, I believe we could save the federal government a lot of money. You wouldn't have nearly as much paperwork, but you would have somebody making sure that those children in Title I schools, because my kids have attended Title I schools, I'm not sure if the school, we can't figure out whether the high school my youngest son is in is a Title I or not, but the elementary schools that my kids went to and in my community are Title I. Many of the schools in my district are Title I, and these are important programs to take care of disabled children. So I'm just submitting to you, Mr. Chairman, as we resolve these issues and try to figure out a way to keep the government from spending itself into oblivion, that this is one alternative. And I understand most of my colleagues on the Republican side of here may be uncomfortable adopting my position, but that's my position. But it tells us that there are more than one way to solve the problem of making sure we take care of these kids, just like Mr. Scott wants them taken care of, I want them taken care of, who have special needs. And you would agree that there are many ways we can take care of that besides having tens of thousands of employees in Washington, D.C. perusing paperwork filed by the thousands of schools across just the Commonwealth of Virginia. Would you not agree with that?
Yeah.
Well, I was asking Mr. Wahlberg, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
I would agree with that, and I look forward to debating that when we have that bill in front of us.
You have that bill in front of you.
And Mr. Scott, well, it's a different bill.
You have that bill in front of you.
This bill?
No, the Equity and Inclusion Enforcement
CCRA.
Act. Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act, which would overturn the Sandoval decision
Well,
that prohibits trial lawyers from filing.
All right. We'll get to that another day.
Individual right, you don't have an individual right to bring a suit.
I understand.
Department of
So,
Education has to do it.
Reclaiming
And so
my
I agree
time
with you.
from
If
my
we
good.
could- If we could repeal
Reclaiming
that.
my time from my good colleague, I'm going to move to another subject. And this one has vexed me as well as I've been sitting here. We keep hearing about, well, if somebody violates these rules related to, donations and they don't file properly, who's going to take care of it? Who's going to take care of it? Well, it's actually in the bill. I mean, it may be a lot of work for the secretary, but the secretary notifies the attorney general to bring action. There's a civil action proceeding in here. When I was reading this over the weekend, as things were going forward and I'm reading it, I recognized that you really just need the secretary and the attorney general's office. Is that not correct?
That's correct, and it multiplies over time.
The penalties do.
Correct.
But it's still the same enforcement mechanism. The secretary notifies the attorney general's office and the attorney general pursues a civil action against the university. Correct.
Correct.
I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jack.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. First and foremost, I want to congratulate Mr. Baumgartner. He is a part of our freshman class. We elected him to be our policy representative during our freshman class election, so I want to laud him for his leadership on this specific issue. And Chairman Wahlberg, I only have one question. Some schools have argued that this act, the fines associated with it are punitive and would harm students. They also claim foreign influence doesn't directly harm students, and I would just welcome your thoughts and to brief this distinguished committee on the enforcement processes within the Deterrent Act.
I thank the gentleman for the question. No, it doesn't harm students at all. I think it protects them. It enables these universities and colleges to spend the time necessary on education, make sure that indoctrination and other clandestine activities that would come from sources like Russia, Iran, China, North Korea are not taking away from the academic opportunities that they need to learn an education. And it also assures the taxpayer, it assures the constituent, it assures the student that they're going to be spending their time on the necessities of education as opposed to getting dollars from places that will ultimately destroy the education experience that they have.
I'm glad you put that on the record, and with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Norman?
Thank both of you for appearing today. You know, what's interesting, and I've got a friend of mine who's attending the first meeting of rules. You've been barraged with questions about the Department of Education cutting the workforce 50%. And I've heard things like gutting of function of government as it relates to the Department of Education, not paying for disabled children, paying for teachers in the classroom. Do any of the employees of the Department of Education do any of this? Your answer was what?
No.
And what's interesting is they keep referring to Musk as a billionaire. Yes, he's done very well in the private sector. But what he's doing is uncovering facts that the public, we've never had a chance to see. Now, let me ask you, and either of these numbers that they're coming up with are either true or false. And he's got a tremendous, I would assume, liability if they're false. But what he's uncovered so far on the DOGE findings, the 29 grants, DEI grants, totaled $101 million. One agency sought to train students to help students understand and interrogate the complex histories. You know what that is? Because I don't.
I'm glad you
The 89 contracts worth $881 billion. One contractor was paid $1.5 million, quote, to observe mailing and clerical operations. Does the $1.5 million go to help disabled children or to repair any of the buildings or to raise the pay of any of the teachers?
It doesn't appear to.
So really, they're opposed to the findings that the American people have a right to know anyway. It's their money. If a physician lets half of his nursing staff go, who do they answer to? The public, their customers. Who is it's really embarrassing to say any agency that was formed, I think the Department of Education was formed in 1979, they can just hire as they will because they have no checks and balances. Does any private institution, any business operate like that?
If they want to stay in business, they don't.
Right, because they go out of business. So it's really laughable that they're against any type of knowing where the money's going. None of it is going to the things they say that they care the most about, which most Americans do. But on your bill, what has been uncovered has been staggering. The $40 million in unreported research contracts with the CCP, the Confucius Institutes that we looked into 6 years ago, one of my college and another one from a state college. You know who started calling me after we started questioning it? Lobbyists. They had something to gain from it. So I like your bill. Thank you for bringing this up. If we can't find out this among the countries that are not our friends, then I don't know why we exist up here. So thank you for bringing this up, and look forward to supporting your bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Norman. And thank you both Chairman Wahlberg and Mr. Scott. Thank you for coming, and you are excused. Hello. We're gonna. I now welcome our second panel, or at least half of our second panel, Representative Latta and Ranking Member Pallone, I understand, has been delayed. So what I thought we would do was go ahead and start. And if he is able to join us or a replacement, I understand they were looking for potential replacement, we will let him join in. But I would, your statement will be submitted for the record, and we ask that you summarize your statement in 5 minutes. Representative Latta, I welcome your testimony.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and members of the committee. Really appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today. I'm pleased to speak in support of 2 resolutions of disapproval introduced under the Congressional Review Act to repeal some of President Biden's midnight regulations. Thank you. To repeal some of President Biden's midnight regulations implementing unnecessary and costly energy efficiency standards for walk-in coolers and freezers and commercial refrigeration equipment. Under the Energy Policy Conservation Act, EPCA, DOE must evaluate energy efficiency standards for equipment categories every 6 years, but it may only impose new amended standards if it finds that such standards are technologically feasible, economically justified, and will result in a significant energy savings. Neither standard we are discussing today meets these statutory requirements, and both should be repealed. HJ Res 24, introduced by the gentlelady from Oklahoma's 5th District, repeals the Department of Energy's final rule implementing amended energy efficiency standards for walk-in coolers and walk-in freezers. Walk-in coolers and freezers are a staple in grocery stores, gas stations, convenience stores, and businesses across the country. These stores are essential in providing American families and households with safe and fresh food and drinks, as well as other products that must be stored in cold temperatures. Walk-in coolers and freezers are large, expensive pieces of equipment. Replacing an existing product can often require retrofitting infrastructure to accommodate a new model. By mandating new efficiency standards, which were last amended only a few years ago, DOE's final rule forces retailers to observe major upfront costs by purchasing and installing new equipment while juggling operational disruptions and supply chain disruptions. While DOE estimates the cost of this final rule to be about $960 million, it does not adequately account for installation costs like required restructuring of a building or operational costs that result from store downtime and reduced sales. Many of these businesses operate within a thin margin, sometimes 1%, 2%, or 3%, which limits their ability to invest significant capital in mandated technologies. This will result in extended use of outdated and less efficient equipment or significant price increases. The consumer is going to incur that cost. This final rule will have an outsized impact on small and independent businesses. 90% of food and drink retailers are defined as small businesses, and they're often the sole provider for groceries in rural communities, and that's true in my district. In fact, the small independent grocery industry is a vital piece of the U.S. economy, contributing $200 billion in annual economic output and employing millions of Americans. Unfortunately, the cost-prohibitive nature of this final rule jeopardizes the economic viability of many small businesses, especially in rural and disadvantaged areas, and Congress should take action to protect small businesses across the country when it comes to the access to food and drink of the retailer of their choice. HJ Res 75, which was introduced by the gentleman from Texas' 12th District, appeals the Department of Energy's final rule implementing amended energy efficiency standards for commercial refrigeration equipment, commonly referred to as CRE. The commercial refrigeration equipment encompasses a broad variety of products, including refrigerators, freezers, display cases, beverage coolers, and more. Despite compliance for new stringent standards for covered equipment becoming effective just 3 years ago, the Biden DOE finalized new standards that will require energy reductions up to 60% on top of the previous standards. To meet these standards, manufacturers will be forced to raise prices on equipment that is already extremely expensive, and there's also uncertainty regarding the technological feasibility of being able to meet these standards, as many refrigerants are being phased out by the EPA. As prices of CRE continue to rise, projected payback periods for the purchase become more and more unattainable. For example, one popular refrigerator designed vertically closed transparent commercial refrigerators is estimated by the DOE to have a payback of almost 94 years. For retailers, many of which are small and family-owned businesses, it does not make economic sense to purchase equipment that will take nearly 100 years to recoup the cost. DOE's final rule also jeopardizes food safety for consumers as base the standards on faulty test procedures that do not match real-world conditions. For example, DOE's estimate of a number of door openings in 1 hour does not reflect a busy store. Therefore, it is likely that the appliance's interior temperature may rise above the safe food storage conditions, risking spoiled food and beverages. The Biden DOE went well beyond its authority in both these standards and will result in finalized rules that will crush small businesses, hurt consumers, and force equipment prices skyrocket. We must right the wrongs of the previous administration by repealing these final rules. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting HJ Res 24 and HJ Res 75, and I thank the chair and yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lather. Mr. Pallone, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox and members of the committee, ranking member. I am here to oppose HJ Res 24 and HJ Res 75, and I have to be honest that it really seems like Republicans are just continuing their strategy of killing time on the House floor until they finally bring up their budget resolution, because we've had so many of these, efficiency standards efforts to get rid of the efficiency standards. It seems like it's just killing time. But in any case, I strongly oppose both of these resolutions. I think they're a distraction from what the Republicans are really trying to do, which is with their budget resolution to cut Medicaid, and also the daily distraction from the daily chaos we see with the Trump administration and the uncertainty about the economy that President Trump has created, and also a distraction from Elon Musk and his minions running around federal agencies, cutting, firing people and the rest. So as Republicans continue to cede power to the executive branch and weaken our own congressional power, I just want to say the Democrats are going to continue to fight for the American people. Now, President Trump and congressional Republicans made a lot of promises to the American people, and one of their main campaign promises was to lower costs. However, every day we have more stories about the impacts of tariffs, the rising cost of groceries, the possible recession that Trump seems content to create. And instead of pursuing policies that fix these problems of their own making, Republicans want to talk about commercial refrigerators and freezer standards. And I have to be clear in saying that the resolutions before us today do absolutely nothing to help the average American. First is HJ Res 24, which targets recently finalized efficiency standards for walk-in coolers and freezers. And then there's HJ Res 75, which targets efficiency standards for commercial refrigerators and freezers. I'll start out by saying there's no regular order, right? I think you know by now on the committee that in the Energy and Commerce Committee, regular orders, bill gets introduced, comes to our committee. We have a hearing in the subcommittee. We have a markup in the subcommittee. We have a markup in the full committee. And then it goes to you in rules before it goes to the floor. Well, none of that has happened, right? There's no regular order. There was no committee process. There was no witness testimony. So once again, Republicans are pretending to know more about energy efficiency standards than the experts that weighed in on the standards, and we're all but guessing as to the actual impacts of these resolutions because we've had no regular order. But first, the efficiency standards targeted by these resolutions lower costs for American businesses. Walk-in coolers, freezers, commercial refrigerators are used in restaurants, convenience stores, and supermarkets across the country. By establishing more stringent efficiency standards for these products, businesses will see significantly lower energy bills. The standards targeted by the first one, HR Res 24 for walk-in coolers and freezers, that one saves businesses $6.5 billion and will reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 29 million metric tons over 30 years. That's the standards. And then the standards targeted by the second resolution, HJ Res 75. These are the commercial refrigerators and the freezers. Those standards will save businesses $4.6 billion over 30 years, will offset the upfront cost of the new products in about 3.5 years and will reduce emissions by nearly 20 million metric tons over 30 years. So I just don't understand why Republicans are trying to raise the cost of doing business in America, especially at a moment when their policies are already raising everyday costs for the average American. So without these efficiency standards, you'll see more strain on the electric grid, increased cost to consumers, increased reliance on fossil fuels, and as usual, Republicans are doing the bidding of their industry and polluter friends rather than working for the American people. So for all these reasons, Madam Chair and members of the committee, I strongly oppose H.R. Res. 24 and H.J. Res. 75, and yield back the balance of my time, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Pallone. I'm always tempted when somebody comes in to tell me about the fact that we're rejecting experts and you're letting amateurs do things, of something I read many, many years ago, that the Titanic was built by experts and the Ark by amateurs. And so I will always go with the Ark as opposed to the Titanic. So, Mr. Pallone, telling me these things were recommended by experts doesn't strengthen the case for me. But Representative Latta, I saw you thinking a little bit about what Mr. Pallone was saying, and I suspect that you've heard concerns from Main Street America regarding the rules, and that maybe the statistics you have don't quite comport with the statistics that Mr. Pallone has.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and you're absolutely correct. You know, when you go out and look at these numbers that we've seen that have come in, we were talking about probably about $1 billion, and you're talking about a lot of businesses out there that are operating on a 1% to 2% margin. And when I say a 1% to 2% margin, a lot of times it's even less than that. Then you have another issue out there is that when the government comes up with the standards, the question is, can you even meet these standards where you are today? And when you're taking out certain types of refrigerants that are being used today, and then you're saying, okay, find another product that's going to replace it, and then also build another type of machine for it, then you have another issue. So it's a real issue out there that you have to go really look at on ground level. And I tell you, when I've across my district, you know, what I've not heard from people saying we want, you know, these higher standards out there that's almost unattainable to be met, and it's going to drive up the cost for the consumer, and it's also going to hurt a lot of the small independent businesses out there that own these machines and these refrigerators, because again, it's a cost factor, but again, you want to make sure that when a standard is put out that it's attainable.
So do the final rules meet the statutory requirements prescribed by EPCA for new and amended standards? I think what you're telling me is that they don't meet the standards to be technologically feasible, cost-effective, and result in significant energy savings based on what you're saying.
Well, you're absolutely correct, because again, just to repeat what you just mentioned, and I mentioned in my testimony, that, you know, the standards have to be technologically feasible, economically justified, and will result in significant energy savings. And we don't see that being proved. Yeah, but we do know this. It's going to be much more expensive to be able to try to manufacture one of these products. It's going to be much more difficult to go out there and find a refrigerant that's going to work. And so, you know, when you make a standard out there, you want to make sure you got something out there that you can attain it by.
Thank you very much. Ms. Scanlon, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Is that correct, Mr. Pallone? Don't the regulations, when they're developing them, have to take into account the state of play in the current scientific world and whether or not these are actually economically feasible?
Well, that's what you're saying is certainly true, but I also want to stress that, you know, DOE under the law has an obligation to review efficiency, in this case of the coolers and walk-in refrigerators. So it's not like they just make this stuff up. In other words, they're required periodically to do this review, and if they find that they can have more efficient refrigerators or freezers, then they're required to have their experts look at it and see if if that's the case. And the figures that I gave you, I'm not going to repeat them again about the cost savings and the efficiency, and not only cost savings to the consumer, but also how much less, greenhouse gas, if you will, goes into the atmosphere. These are the determinations they made. Now, I must say, I do like the chairwoman's analogy with the Ark and the, who is it, the Ark and the Titanic. But I mean, the bottom line is, if you really wanted to question what Department of Energy has done here, then we should have had regular order, and the Department of Energy could have come in, and we could have had experts. The Republicans are in the majority. They could have had people come in and say why they don't agree with the department, but that never happened, and that's what gets me aggravated, I guess. I remember, he's not here anymore, but I remember one day we had this on the refrigerators, and Mr. Massey came in one day and said that he had spent the weekend going around looking at refrigerators, and he kind of chastised me because I hadn't. Well, I'm not the expert, you know what I mean? What is the point of my spending the weekend? Not that I'm trying to be critical of them, because I like them, but what would be the point of my going around to restaurants and checking out refrigerators? I'm not the experts. The experts have spoken, and they're saying there are these savings, right? And yet we've had nothing on the other side that said it's not true, because there's never been regular order.
Right, and I share that frustration as well as the one you opened with, that this is not a good use of this body's time. I mean, we all just spent a week in district. I did 2 town halls in my district and 1 in another district where the congressman wasn't showing up, and nobody asked about energy standards for refrigerators, whether walk-in or otherwise. What they did ask about was lost jobs due to DOGE cuts and layoffs due to tariff wars, and they had a lot of concerns about Medicaid and SNAP and cuts to Social Security and the VA and the post office, but not once did refrigerator standards come up, because that's not the moment that we're in, and we really should be addressing the unconstitutional and illegal incursions upon Congress's Article 1 authority to determine what kind of services are being provided to the American people and are funded for the American people, and not having some rogue billionaire cutting things along with his band of 20-year-olds. So I don't know, did you hear something different at your town halls?
No, and last week I had not only a town hall, but went to so many different meetings, and all the biggest concern people had was the possibility of a recession,
right?
Because consumer confidence is down, the markets goes up and down every day. People are scared. That's what they're worried about. They're afraid that President Trump is not making things more affordable, in fact making them less affordable, and that we might face an economic downturn as a result of his policies.
And Mr. Latta, you didn't have a town hall where people talked about refrigerator standards, did you?
I tell you, I was at my district all last week, and one of the things that people do worry about are food prices. And again, if all of a sudden you're having costs going up, or in a lot of cases you might have fewer types of choices, because these companies, they won't be able to manufacture the refrigerators and the freezers, and at the same time, consumers aren't going to have that choice as what they want. And so people want to make sure that prices aren't going up, they're going down. But what we're going to see through this, if we don't get these 2 CRAs done, we're going to see prices going up.
Okay. Of course, this does bring the price of running your refrigerator down, but, I do see you didn't have a town hall last week, right?
No, but I was out in my district, and also,
Okay.
I tell you where I also was in grocery stores buying groceries. And I have a lot of people come up, and I'm sure like all members do, you have people come up and are very concerned about what the costs are, and they don't want to see costs going up, but we'll see costs definitely go up if we see these go into effect.
I would suggest that the costs will go up much more from the tariff wars that the president is engaged in, but with that, I would yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Scanlon. Mr. Scott, you're recognized. Ms. Leisure-Fernandez, you're recognized.
Thank you. It's sort of like we have this Republican fridge fetish, right? They keep bringing these appliance bills that raise the cost of operating appliances, right? So their bills make it more expensive for consumers to have their toasters, their refrigerators, you know, freedom for refrigerators. It would almost seem comical, except for that we are in a constitutional crisis. We are in a place where President Trump is ignoring the Constitution. He's saying he's going to ignore the courts. They want to impeach judges because they don't like their decision. That is not consistent with the Constitution. And Republicans seem to be too afraid to stand up for either the Constitution or for their constituents, because they're not showing up at town halls. Representative, I understand that there actually was a town hall, that there was an empty chair for you. That might not have been too nice, but that, you know, the issues that were raised were farmers who were worried about the USDA cuts, the Social Security, the cuts to Social Security, where people are starting to not see their checks. You know, these cuts to the Department of Education, and the seemingly co-president, Musk, running amok. And, you know, people are talking about the rising costs, but they're worried because they understand that Trump's tariffs raise costs. So they're worried about how expensive eggs are getting, and then you're going to make it more expensive to put them in the refrigerator because the refrigerator is going to cost you more to run. And I will say that we have heard that there are some of our Republican colleagues who have had town halls, and I looked at some of those, didn't see any of them raise commercial fridges. At Senator Grassley's town hall, he was asked about his work on oversight, and he was the quote from one of his constituents was, "Trump and his people are moving very rapidly toward a dictatorship and an oligarchy," unquote. Representative Hageman heard from a Department of Agriculture employee who had helped Wyoming farmers deal with the drought. She was fired despite the fact that she had had high marks, and she was concerned about the devastating impact of Doge's cuts. I call it Dodgy because they don't seem to tell us anything anytime. That what was going to happen to American farmers with those cuts. Representative Flood heard from Nebraskans about cuts ranging from cuts to the veteran care to life-saving breast cancer research. One constituent asked, why is Elon Musk a better person to audit our government for race, fraud, and abuse than the inspectors general that Donald Trump fired? None of these town halls in red states, districts, blue states, seem at all concerned about the bill we're dealing with here, except for Ranking Member, tell us again, how much will the regulations save the small businesses and restaurants over time? Because this is a cost-saving regulation that they're going to overturn, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the resolution that deals with the walk-in coolers and freezers saves businesses $6.5 billion, and it's from the DOE, and will reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 29 million metric tons over 30 years, and the standards targeted by the resolution relating to commercial refrigerators and freezers save businesses $4.6 billion over 30 years. And, I know he didn't, Bob didn't say anything about the upfront costs, but a lot of times I get that from the Republicans. Oh, there's upfront costs. But what DOE says is the offset, this will offset the upfront costs of the new products in about 3.5 years. So,
So in 3 years, you were paid back. I read the analysis. In 3 years, you get paid back in energy savings.
Right.
In
So
3
3 years, you
paid
get
back.
those savings over 30 as
Right.
opposed to the.
Yeah, so in 3 years, and then after that, you're just saving money.
Exactly.
Right? So I don't understand why, and that's the case with all of these appliance bills that we've had, right? That you save money. The consumer saves money. The small business saves money. The restaurants operate on very tight margins. And if they can save money over time, that is really key. And those walk-in refrigerators and stuff, they last for a while. So they're going to be saving you money for a good while. So I just don't understand why, when Americans are so concerned, as the representative noted, about costs, but this is not what they care about. They care about the fact that those Trump tariffs are going to cost them so much, and everything he's done so far has made life more expensive. We cannot avoid Trump. That's just the reality of what we're facing. With that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Leisure Fernandez. Mr. Griffith?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Chairman, is there anything that you would like to add that you haven't already had an opportunity to say?
Well, I thank the gentleman and Madam Chair. You know, when we're talking about costs, I think that's important because if you go back just to looking at what DOE said when we were talking about the commercial refrigeration equipment, and this, again, this is what you're talking about when you're looking at refrigerators, freezers, display cases, coolers, and more, that DOE, you know, you're looking at about a 94-year payback. 94 years. I'm not sure how many stores can make it for 94 years, and I know a lot of people can't afford a 94-year payback.
Anything else, Mr. Chairman?
Well, again, I highly recommend and ask for passage of both CRAs by the Rules Committee.
I appreciate that. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Jack, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll just speak for a moment, Mr. Latta, if I could. So I count 38 independent grocers in my district, and you know the estimates would be 2,000 to 3,000 people within my communities are employed by independent grocers. So I'm just curious if you could walk me through, if these final rules are not repealed, what can my constituents, both the small businesses directly impacted and the consumers they serve, expect to happen to their local food and drink retailers?
Well, I thank the gentleman for the question. You know, again, first of all, you're going to see a problem that you're going to have to be able to meet making the refrigerators or the freezers that are going to be out there. That's going to be the first question. Can the manufacturers even produce it? Number two, can they get the refrigerant? Now, the number three would be the next problem you're going to have is it's going to increase the costs for the consumer because the retailer is going to have to go out there and buy new equipment if they can afford it. If you're a small mom and pop type place, you're going to have a problem out there to be able to do that. Then you're going to have an issue that if you don't have enough freezers, you're going to start reducing consumer choice. And so that consumer choice goes down because all of a sudden what you thought you were buying multiple things, you might only have a choice for one or two things. So you're going to see costs going up, choice going down, and it's going to be hopefully that, you know, these people out there that are out there trying to make a living on a 1 to 2 to 3% margin can survive.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. McGovern.
Oh, Madam Chair, I mean, today we've read about a national security breach. We're reading about how Elon Musk is trying to screw around with Social Security. The tariffs are raising prices on everybody as we speak. And so talking about walk-in refrigeration and freezers is not high on my list right now, so I will yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. Mr. Norman, you're recognized.
Mr. Latta, thank you for bringing these to our attention. Who pays the cost of electricity on the 150,000 convenience stores?
Well, that would be the consumer and the user out there. So if you're a convenience store out there, you have to buy that electricity.
So the federal government doesn't come pay any electricity costs. They just want to issue these mandates that they think they can. They're more of an expert than the people investing their hard-earned money trying to run a business. And what does this do to that entrepreneur who can't afford this and cannot afford or wait 99 years to get a payback?
Well, again, I thank the gentleman for the question. It comes down to what happens. Well, if you can't afford the walk-in cooler, you can't afford the freezer for the consumer out there, then all of a sudden they stop coming to your business, and all of a sudden it's a kind of a cascading effect because not only does that store go out of business, people lose their jobs, and then the consumer out there is like, okay, where am I going to go? And I'm sure, like in your district, like in mine, you have a lot of rural area. That convenience store might be the closest thing you have to the nearest grocery store, so that's where you go. And I know in a lot of my small towns, you might be 10, 15 miles between stores, and that little store in that town is what is that focal point. So you're absolutely correct. The federal government's not paying the cost. It comes down to that store. And if they, it might be they say we're going to have to pass that on to the consumer. But at some point, the consumer says we can't afford that either.
So the taxpayer gets, the consumer is the one that suffers the consequences of not having more stores to shop at and shop the product because of the owner who's putting his hard-earned money up, not the federal government, cannot afford to do that at this time.
That's correct.
Well, thank you for putting this up, and it's both these bills should pass. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Norman. I want to thank our witnesses again for being here today. You're excused. Seeing no other members wishing to testify.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Seeing no other members wishing to testify on H.R. 1048, H.J. Res. 24, or H.J. Res. 25, this closes the hearing portion of our meeting. The chair will be in receipt of a motion from the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move the committee grant H.J. Res. 24, providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5 United States Code of the Rules submitted by the Department of Energy relating to Energy Conservation Program, Energy Conservation Standards for walk-in coolers and walk-in freezers, a closed rule. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the joint resolution. The rule provides that the joint resolution shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the joint resolution. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce or their respective designees. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.J. Res. 75, providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5 United States Code of the Rules submitted by the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. The Department of Energy's relating to Energy Conservation Program, Energy Conservation Standards for commercial refrigerators, freezers, and refrigerator freezers under a closed rule. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the joint resolution. The rule provides that the joint resolution shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the joint resolution. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce or respective designees. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 1048, the Deterrent Act, under a structured rule. The rule waives all points of order against the consideration of the bill. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Education and Workforce or their respective designees. The rule provides that in lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Education and Workforce now printed in the bill, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 119-1 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes in order only those amendments printed in the Rules Committee report. Each amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to demand for division of the question. All points of order against the amendments printed in the report are waived. Finally, the rule provides 1 motion to recommit. I so move.
Thank you, Mr. Griffith. You've now heard the motion. Is there any discussion or amendment to the rule?
Yes, Madam Chair, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order amendment number 12 to H.R. 1048 offered by Representatives Houlihan and Hayes, which states that the bill shall not go into effect if the Department of Education is dismantled or any funds made available by previous appropriation acts to the Department of Education are revoked or altered to reduce the authority and function of the Department of Education. Madam Chair, the Department of Education does something that the underlying bill here doesn't do. It actually helps people. It helps students. If the department is dismantled, we could have disruptions to FAFSA, delays in resolving fixes to borrowers' accounts, and wider educational disparities for students with disabilities and children from low-income backgrounds. But clearly, the bill before us recognizes that the Department of Education has some value. So this amendment is simple. If you actually want the Department of Education, if you actually want the department this bill vests with more authority to exist, then you can't dismantle it. This is common sense, and I yield back.
Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Ask
The
for a roll
amendment is
call.
not agreed to. The gentleman's asked for a roll call. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Fishbach?
No.
Mrs. Fishbach? No. Mr. Norman? No. Mr. Norman? No. Mr. Roy? Mrs. Houchin? No. Mrs. Houchin? No. Mr. Langworthy? Mr. Scott? No. Mr. Scott? No. Mr. Griffith? No. Mr. Griffith? No. Mr. Jack?
No.
Mr. Jack? No. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern? Aye. Ms. Scanlon?
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Mr. Neguse? Ms. Ledger Fernandez? Ms. Ledger Fernandez? Aye. Madam Chair?
No.
Madam Chair? No.
The clerk will report the total.
3 yeas, 7 nays.
The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there other amendments or discussion? Hearing none, the question is on the rule. All those in favor, say aye. 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 Those opposed?
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
I ask for a roll call, Madam Chair.
Mr. McGovern's asked for a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Fishbach?
Yes.
Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Norman? Mr. Norman? Aye. Mr. Roy? Mrs. Houchin? Aye. Mrs. Houchin? Aye. Mr. Langworthy? Mr. Scott? Aye. Mr. Scott? Aye. Mr. Griffith? Aye. Mr. Griffith? Aye. Mr. Jack?
Aye.
Mr. Jack? Aye. Mr. McGovern?
No.
Mr. McGovern? No. Ms. Scanlon? No. Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Neguse? Ms. Ledger Fernandez? No. Ms. Ledger Fernandez? No. Madam Chair?
Aye.
Madam Chair? Aye.
The clerk will report the total.
7 yeas, 3 nays.
The ayes have it. The motion to report is agreed to. Accordingly, I will be managing this rule for the majority.
And Mr. Neguse for the minority.
Mr. Neguse for the minority. Is there any further discussion? If not, then the Rules Committee meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.